Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our third-party risk management governance documents, What You Need to Know webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you're unfamiliar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide the widgets. You can expand your side area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout the session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to be logged in individually with your own credentials, answer all 3 of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during the presentation, be in attendance for the entire live 1-hour session, and complete the follow-up survey. We will be sending the link to that follow-up survey 24 hours after the live session. If you meet all requirements, we'll be sending your CPE certificate within 5 to 7 business days following survey submission. With us today, we have Hillary Dewhurst, Venminder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy. She will discuss what third-party risk management governance documents are and why they're necessary for your organization to have. Hillary will also walk through how to develop and maintain each governance document. You will see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our guide to your third-party risk management policy, program, and procedures ebook, our How to Use the RACI method to determine third-party risk management responsibilities infographic and template, our Creating and Updating Your Third-Party Risk Management Policy ebook, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the Related Content widget. With all that being said, I would like to hand it over to Hillary. Hillary, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion, which is all about governance documents. We're going to jump right in with what governance documents are and why they're important. Then we're going to look at the difference between these different documents and tell you how to develop each one. We'll also get into how to review and mature your governance documents, and we'll end up with some key takeaways. So let's go ahead and get started. So the very first question most of us have is, what is third-party risk management documentation? Well, first of all, these are the documents that formalize your third-party risk management program. So this includes your policy, your program document, or maybe your operating standards and all of your procedures. These documents really provide guidance and information at all levels of the organization, and they're meant to clearly spell out all the rules and requirements necessary for effective third-party risk management execution at your organization. So why do we need these documents? Well, first of all, we need them to really outline those rules and requirements and expectations. This is very important because as an organization, we all need to be singing from the same songbook, as that old saying goes. But we also need to make sure that the rules are clearly spelled out for everyone. In addition, we need to make sure that we have documented evidence for our auditors and regulatory examiners to show that we do have that formalized program. These documents are absolutely the best way to evidence that you do. We also want to make sure that there's really no room for ambiguity or that people don't misinterpret the requirements or, shape them in a way that suits them best. We're just really spelling it out. But most importantly, we want to formalize these processes through documentation because when they're documented, it's much easier to make them operational. And of course, all stakeholders need to know and understand their specific responsibilities. And we want to give them practical instructions on how to execute these tasks and activities as well. Now, when we're talking about third-party risk management governance documents, most commonly we're going to hear people talk about policies and procedures, or as some people like to call them PMP. But not as common, we will also talk today about programs. Some people call these operating standards or playbooks, but these are the documents that supplement your policy and procedures and clearly call out all of those processes that help us meet those requirements in our policy. All right, I really love this slide because it's a great visualization of that governance document hierarchy. Now, don't worry, we're going to get into each of these documents in more detail, but the short version is that at the top we have the policy, and the policy is defining what is required to meet regulatory guidelines, best practices, or expected standards. Beneath that, we have the program, which is describing all of the processes necessary to execute the policy requirements. Underneath that, we are going to have those procedures, and we'll probably have a lot of different procedures, and these are the detailed instructions on how to execute those processes. This graphic was also designed to show that in terms of content, the policy is probably going to have the least amount of content, followed by the program, and then you are going to have many procedures that support those processes. So let's get started with that foundational piece of documentation, which would be your policy. It's generally the only mandated piece of information, but as a matter of fact, it is required by a majority of the regulators. But the policy provides all the details around the rules, principles, guidelines, etc., for third-party risk management at your organization. The policy is always written to direct and exert influence and decisions about third-party risk management activities and to stay within a certain set of boundaries. Again, this goes back to making sure that people don't misinterpret or conflate those rules. And for regulated industries, we always want to make sure that we can reflect those requirements found in established guidelines. We should generally write the policy first and the other documentation after. All right, now let's talk about program documents. Keep in mind, again, some organizations may refer to this particular document as an operating standard, a playbook, or something like that, but this is really an internal document that follows the concepts of the policy but fills in the details around the processes required to meet that policy. This document is not only for everybody who actually touches and works on third-party risk management, but it's also for senior management as well, so they can understand the general workflow, processes, requirements, and roles and responsibilities of all the stakeholders. Now, again, I know some senior executives who think of third-party risk management as like making sausage, right? You don't want to know what goes into it, and you don't want to see it being done. The truth is that the opposite is really the case. While everyone in third-party risk management knows that it can be complex, it actually benefits everyone in the organization to understand what goes into it and how it's done. Another important element of a program document is that it follows the third-party risk management lifecycle and illustrates the specific objectives and requirements, as well as who's responsible for them during each phase of the lifecycle. Having that kind of clarity really takes the mystery out of these processes. And when your stakeholders are more knowledgeable, it's likely that the processes take less time and are more effective. So that brings us to procedures. A lot of people call these desktop procedures, that's fine, but these are the documents that are specifically step-by-step instructions for how to accomplish a specific process. And they should always be written in a way that anybody can follow the directions and essentially get the same result. Procedures should be specific to single workflows or systems and department specific. So when we think about procedures, some examples might be like how to upload a document or how to respond to a system request. These are really the documents that are written at a level that is meant to be purely instructive, like press this button, navigate to this screen, look for this information, submit the form. You get the idea. One thing I'd like to call out about procedures is to make sure that the people who are actually responsible for the process are the ones writing it or at least reviewing those procedures before they're published, because there's often a gap between how things should be done ideally and how they're done in reality. So keep that in mind when it comes to procedures. So now that we've had a little bit of background on the different types and purposes of the documents, before you jump in and start developing or updating your document, it's really important to understand the purpose and the audience, as well as the format for each type of document here. So here are some questions we want to ask. What is the purpose? Who is our audience? What information and content should be included and excluded? And what is the most practical and easy to use format for the document? Now, while you think about that, we are ready for our first poll. Jessie?
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, policy. Does your organization have a formal third-party risk management policy? Yes, it's in progress, no, or you're not sure. Hillary, it looks like we have some time to answer a question from the audience.
Let's do it.
Great. Do regulators require you to have a program document?
Actually, they do not. Now, regulators are very clear about having policies and procedures. It's important to keep in mind that the program document is more of a best practice, and it's something that can be super helpful because it provides all that information that's not really in the policy, but is too much for your individual procedures. And again, that information is all of the descriptions of the processes you use to meet those requirements in the policy, and who's responsible for each activity or task, what approvals are necessary, how those things might flow from one to another. So while it's not a requirement, it's absolutely worth considering creating one for your program, as it can be super helpful for your management, your stakeholders, and even your auditors and examiners. I hope that helps.
Thanks everyone for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before we move on, as a reminder, in the Related Content widget, you will find our Guide to Your Third-Party Risk Management Policy, Program, and Procedures ebook available for download. With that, I'll hand it back to you, Hillary.
So before we get into each document, I really want to emphasize how important it is to use direct and specific language in all of your documents. And this really does apply to all of them. You use direct and specific language to avoid any ambiguity in the requirements. So first of all, let's try and get away from the word shall, right? And instead, when it's requirement, use the term must. When something is prohibited, use must not. You could use may for discretionary actions and should as recommended actions. But make sure you're consistent and use this language all the time so that your stakeholders really understand what you mean when you're stating requirements. So just before the poll, I asked you to really think about who the audience was and the purpose of each document. So let's get into those documents and start with the policy, because again, this is your most important document and you have to get it right. So first of all, your policy needs to describe the third-party risk governance structure at a high level and should include core program components, requirements, roles and responsibilities for each stage of the life cycle. This document is meant for all internal employees or contractors that engage third parties. It is our core document to share with our auditor and examiner. And in some cases, you may actually be sharing that policy with your vendors, usually those of an elevated risk. And I'm also aware, because this has happened to me, that sometimes potential investors may also want to see your policy as part of their due diligence or as evidence that you have a good third-party risk management program. Now, of course, all policies don't have to look exactly the same, but they should share some common elements. Some of the most important information should pop up right at the very beginning of your policy. That's your overview, your policy statement, and policy purpose. So let's walk through why these are important. That overview should really state the risk that you're addressing. In this case, we're saying that the organization has a reliance on third-party relationships and they're risky, but that the organization depends on those relationships to maintain its operations. So right there, we've told everyone what third-party risk management is all about in just a couple of sentences. Pretty impressive. All right, now we're going to that policy statement. So if you've ever heard anyone use the term elevator speech, as in you only have a few minutes to get your point across, your policy statement is the equivalent of an elevator speech. It's why we're addressing the risk. So in this case, the organization's use of third parties doesn't diminish its responsibility to manage the risk. That's pretty straightforward. And literally anyone in your organization can understand that statement. So finally, we get to the purpose of the policy and how having the policy helps the organization address those risks. In this example, it basically states that the policy provides the rules and guidelines and outlines the structure for how we manage that risk. So in 3 simple paragraphs, we've described the risk we're addressing, why it's important to address the risk, and how the policy helps us do that. Okay, so why are these paragraphs such a big deal? Well, if we're honest, we know that a lot of people don't actually read a policy, and the most important information should be on the first page. That is why these 3 elements are very important. And who knows, they may sink in enough to compel people to read the rest of the policy. Now, there's a lot more to writing a policy and what to include, and we've included a policy template and companion guidelines and downloads today, so make sure to check them out. All right, let's continue. So we get asked a lot, what should be in the policy, how long should it be, what should be included in it, and what format should it be in. The truth of the matter is that policies can vary as much as the organizations that use them, but I do have some standard advice that can help you create a quality policy. Now, first of all, keep it as brief as possible. If you've heard that the policy should not exceed 5 or 6 pages, that's somewhat of an outdated notion, especially as the regulators have become so prescriptive in their guidance in industries such as financial services. So some of the more complex industries, that 5 to 7 page policy just isn't going to cut it anymore. But that's not to say you shouldn't try and keep your policy concise. Your policy should be professionally written and in an appropriate business tone, but it doesn't need to be a novel, right? If you want to keep it short, make sure that the language is clear and concise. It's also important that your policy reflects your current practices, not your aspirational ones. That is a huge red flag for auditors and examiners if your policy is different than what it is you actually do. And don't add any information that can become easily outdated, like people's names. Put the name of a role instead. Use that clear and direct language, right? And don't say things like, the vendor owner should be responsible for the vendor risk. Say the vendor owner is responsible for the vendor risk. And as fun as they are, avoid using graphics or flowcharts whenever possible, because if they become outdated, it's harder for them to be replaced and requires reformatting the whole document. Save your graphics and flowcharts for your programs and procedures. And instead of referencing text from another policy, just reference the policy name through a hyperlink. That prevents you from having to update the entire document should another policy change. And most importantly, don't include process steps or procedures in your policy. They don't belong there. Again, so if you are in a regulated industry and you want to have a very auditor, examiner-friendly policy, here are some tips. 1, that the board and senior management reviews and approves the policy at least on an annual basis, right? That there's clear third-party risk management, governance, oversight, accountability, and ownership, right? That is completely clear who owns what and who's accountable. Your policy also should dictate that your third-party risk management activity is risk-based or scaled in proportion to the risk. You have a clear definition of what constitutes a critical third party, and you have a clear methodology for risk rating third parties. You'll also want to include what levels of risk you assign and give examples of each. Again, your policy should always reflect exactly what you're doing, your current state, not what you hope to be doing one day or what you should be doing, but what you're actually doing. That language is active and direct, and most importantly, the policy is communicated, right? And it's accessible to everyone in the organization who has responsibility for third-party risk management. Now, if your policy is sitting on a SharePoint file that only 20 people in the organization have access to, that's not a good thing. Every single person in your organization that engages third parties or the third-party risk management process should know where and how to access that policy, and they should be encouraged to read it and acknowledge it as well. All right, let's talk briefly about developing your program document or that operating standard. So the purpose of this document is to have that detailed explanation of the entire program and how it's executed throughout the organization. It should follow all the life stages of the third-party risk management life cycle and clearly call out the objectives, requirements, roles, and responsibilities for each stage. This document also should be a comprehensive outline of all those processes and tools that are used to execute third-party risk management. But this document does not contain procedures. I'll say it again, no procedures in your program document. So let's think about the audience. Well, it's all internal employees or contractors. It's senior management, it's auditors, it's examiners. You may want to look at it, and again, it may actually be for your investors as part of their due diligence to validate that you do have a strong third-party risk management program. So we'll pause and talk about programs here for just a little bit because not every organization has them, but they are very important and they can help you avoid a lot of issues if you have a good program document. So first of all, they're meant to be detailed because they're supposed to educate and inform the stakeholders. And to properly set your expectations, these documents are usually quite large and do take some time to put together. But the program document is an excellent place for your flow charts and your RACI charts, your illustrations, whatever you think is helpful for that stakeholder. Sometimes our internal processes are very complex and deliverables and ownership may bounce between departments or even as systems. So adding those flow charts or swim lanes or other graphics can really help simplify it for the users, so don't be shy about including those in your program document. Program documents can be an excellent supplement to your vendor owner training. And if you don't have any training, they can actually be a short-term substitute for that training. Although in the long term, I don't recommend that you default to the program document as a substitute for training. But it can be very helpful in helping your stakeholders understand what needs to be done, who's responsible for doing it, and the order in which it should happen. So I did mention a RACI chart in the previous slide. So what are those? If you're not familiar with them, you may wonder what purpose they serve. So many years ago, I learned about RACI charts, and it really opened my eyes. It's a great way to itemize and document roles and responsibilities across your stakeholders. And they can be so useful when you have a lot of different people participating in any one process. Now, first of all, RACI stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consulted, and Informed. Now, there are other versions of the RACI chart that may have more roles or different roles, but I'm a big fan of keeping it simple. So this very basic RACI chart is a great place to start. So we start with who is responsible. This is the individual or the team actually carrying out the work or performing the activity. We also have the accountable role. So this is the person with the ultimate ownership. They have that decision authority, approvals, etc. But they're also the ones who's going to be taken to task if that responsible person or team does not complete their process, their work activity as expected. We also have something called consulted, and this is a person or team that's contributing to or reviewing the activity. This means that we have to have two-way communication with them. We're asking them for input, they're giving it back to us. We have both sides of that communication. That leaves us with the informed role. Now, the informed role are persons or teams that need to know of the activity, but they're not really contributing to it. They're not really giving us any approvals, and we only need to have one-way communication with them. All right, so now that you understand the roles and responsibilities in that general RACI methodology, let's take a look at how this works in practice. Now, this is a sample. Of course, what is appropriate for your organization is going to look different, but we just wanted to help you understand how it works. So it's a very basic table. On the very left-hand side, we have that third-party risk management activity or life cycle stage. A good rule of thumb is to go ahead and follow that life cycle. That way you can make sure you've accounted for all those necessary tasks and activities. The next column is going to be a description. What exactly are we talking about here? You do want to make this very clear so that there's no ambiguity, and you want to break it up in a way that makes sense. So if the planning activity has multiple tasks, you're going to want to list them all out. Now let's just look at the first line here. We do have that planning stage. We have the description of defining the need for and the benefit of that third-party relationship. And then throughout the rest of the page, we have listed all the individual roles that might be involved in third-party risk management. Now again, you can have more, you can have less, whatever makes sense for your organization. But if we look at that first line, we see that in the planning stage, we've got to define the need for and the benefit of the third-party relationship. In this particular activity, third-party risk management is just informed because the vendor owner or line of business is responsible for identifying that need. And their senior management needs to be accountable, which means they need to make sure that they are doing that. In this particular instance, finance may be consulted. Perhaps there's budgetary conditions or something that needs to be approved from a finance perspective, so they would be in that C position. Now, as you can see, we've populated it down just to give a few examples, but again, this will vary based on your organization. But one thing to point out is that every activity needs at least an accountable and a responsible. And not every role is going to participate in every task or activity. So now you may be thinking, oh, that's really interesting, but what does it have to do with my program document, and why should we take the time to break out all these rules and responsibilities in that RACI chart? Well, there are many reasons, but most of all, it's going to provide that clear direction as to who's responsible for what in any one process. And it's also really useful when structuring your program document to make sure that you're covering all your bases and that you've fully considered what each process entails. Finally, there's two reasons that we don't often talk about but are equally as useful. So first of all, by identifying the roles and responsibilities, you're also telling everyone who has a quote-unquote vote in that process. And this is super important because we all have those folks that like to run around and put a stick in the spokes at the last minute. But when we tell a stakeholder that they are in the informed role, it means that yes, I'm going to tell you what's going on and I'm going to inform you of any decisions that have been made. But it also tells them that they don't get to interrupt or derail the process. And I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about, but that in itself is worth its weight in gold. The next reason is that when you tell someone specifically that it is their role of responsibility, you can really eliminate or reduce that sort of not my job kind of mentality and behavior. Because for every responsible, there must be an accountable. So if you're responsible for performing a task or an activity, someone's going to hold ultimately accountability for that work product. In a lot of cases, it's going to be your management. But we always need to know who's responsible for ensuring quality, timeliness, completion of those tasks or activities. So that is why the RACI chart can be an incredibly effective tool within your program document. Okay, so here's some good tips for your program documents. First of all, use that third-party risk management lifecycle as the foundation for your document. It makes it really easy. You can start in onboarding and talk about, planning, who's responsible for what are the activities in that stage, who needs to approve it, be consulted, informed, etc. Always make sure to document your current processes, right, not aspirational ones. And details are really important here, so make sure you state any expectations for, timing, for deliverables, quality, and if it's possible to give an exception. If it is, how do they do that? Use those RACI matrices to really quantify and call out stakeholder accountability, responsibility, and whether they're consulted or informed. And be clear. Make sure to clarify if something is a requirement or a recommended action. And keep it all interesting. Add those workflows, add that chart, add those graphics, whatever it's going to take to help your stakeholders really understand and comprehend the process so they can follow it. And use those program documents to support your training efforts. Keep them up to date. And another thing is, because of the size of these and all the different components, digital documents are always best. So that naturally brings us to procedures, which are those step-by-step instructions for how to execute all those processes we detailed in the program. But procedures can be a hybrid of like checklist or screenshots, maybe from your software system, or any number of written directions. But they should always address just one process at a time and be written in a way that anyone can follow them and get the same outcome. So another best practice when it comes to procedures is to really break them down to one stakeholder and one process at a time. Because, maybe you've tried to follow procedures that weren't really written well or didn't clearly call out who does what in the process or, where your role starts or stops. That can be really unwieldy and hard to follow. So for example, if you have a procedure to help a business line open and complete that inherent risk assessment, keep the instructions limited to what the business line or vendor owner needs to do and only for that specific process. If you create massive procedures that reflect what every stakeholder is doing for multiple processes, making a change to the information can be daunting and it's really hard to follow. Just like having your stakeholders review your program documents, make sure your procedures are tested and reviewed by multiple stakeholders before they're published. Because doing that's going to save you a lot of rework and a lot of complaining from people who are using procedures that they perceive as not working. Now remember, our procedures are basically instructions on how to complete those processes, right? So what kind of things need procedures? Well, here's some examples. We could have procedures on how to update and maintain our records, how to initiate and conduct third-party risk assessments. Maybe there's how to manage data or do some reporting. Maybe we want to have a vendor outreach process for collecting and reviewing due diligence. That one's always very good because, who's reaching out to the vendor? Is it third-party risk management? Is it the vendor owner? Having those detailed processes will really, really help move the process along effectively. We also may want to have a process in there for contract review, approval, etc. You get the idea. All right, some other things to keep in mind when it comes to procedures, right? We always want our procedures to be very comprehensive, like they give us enough information to get the job done, but they're easy to follow. We want to focus on that one process and one stakeholder group at a time, because if I'm the stakeholder, I'm the process owner, I don't need to know what everyone else is doing. I need to know what I'm doing, what I'm looking for, what buttons I'm pushing, right? And on that note, let's sit down, make sure that you're consulting those experts, the people actually who are going to be responsible for fulfilling those procedures. A lot of times, there may be things that they're doing that we don't know about, or we think they should be doing something one way, and that's not the case, so check in. Of course, procedures can change pretty frequently as we do improvements, as things change. Maybe you change your AP system and that has a domino effect down the line. So we need to keep those updated. Again, my favorite thing to say, make sure your procedures are reflecting what you actually do, not what is aspirational or you hope to do one day. And then as you're going through your procedures, really do it in a mindset that asks the question if improvements are possible. It's really common to figure out how ineffective or clunky processes or procedures are rather when we're doing them, and clunky procedures become ineffective procedures, which become procedures that nobody follows. So while you think about procedures, it is time for our next poll. Jessie?
Our second poll question of the day is, does your organization require the board or a designated committee of the board to review and approve the third-party risk management policy? Yes, no, or not sure? Hillary, I have another question here that I think we could go ahead and answer.
Okay.
And that question is, we don't really have a separate vendor management policy, but we do have a few sections about vendor management in our IT policy. Do we need to have a separate vendor management policy?
Yes, and I'll tell you the reason why. One, if you're in a regulated industry, it is a requirement. The other reason to really think about is that when we're talking about all the different requirements that are necessary to have effective third-party risk management, it's really unlikely that you're going to get a fulsome description of those in just a few paragraphs, especially if it's layered in another policy. So my advice would be to definitely pursue creating a separate policy and, getting it approved as a separate policy so that your stakeholders can really understand those specific requirements and rules that you have for third-party risk management at your organization. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks so much, Hillary. We have about 30 seconds left on our open poll questions, so please get those responses in quickly. Just a reminder, if you have any issues submitting the poll question, you can submit a message using the Ask Question widget, and we'll be happy to assist you. If you have any other questions throughout the session, you can also submit those via the Ask Question widget. We'll be closing in just a few seconds. Thank you. Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. A few slides back, we discussed the RACI method and why you should use it when building your program document. In the related content widget, we've provided our How to Use the RACI method to determine third-party risk management responsibilities infographic and toolkit, which you may find helpful as these resources dive further into the topic. Hillary, back to you.
All right, I know we've covered a very broad overview of the different types of governance documents and some suggestions and tips for how to create and maintain them. But once we have them all ready to go, we always think about constant improvement and maturity. So what makes a document mature, right? Well, it's certainly not how long it is or how long it's been around, and it's not about how big it is. But mature documents always have really practical requirements. They're managed frequently, which means that they're reviewed and tested for accuracy and are updated when necessary, and they're accessible for people who need them. Okay, I'm sure there's many folks on the call today that already have their governance documents developed and they're existing. So what we want to think about is what we need to do when we need to update those documents. So let's take a look at the 5 steps we need to do there. All right, so the first thing we want to do with any document, we just kind of want to take inventory. We want to see what's in it. So that begins by collecting and understanding all the different documents that are directly related to your program and maybe indirectly related, say contract management policy, information protection, something of that nature. We want to take time out to talk to our stakeholders and those other teams about the existing documents. Are they satisfied with them? Are they being used? Are they helpful, not helpful, etc.? And then we want to really try and understand what the drivers are for change. So do we need to change the structure or the format of that document? Do we need additional information to make it more useful or to make sure that it's reflecting our current processes? And, perhaps we need to be clear about roles and responsibilities. Whatever it is, you want to kind of do that larger overview first. So now that you understand sort of the bigger picture about those documents, it's time to really get in and read them. One of the first things we're going to be looking for if there are gaps or inconsistencies. So for example, do we call them third parties in this document? Do we call them vendors in that document? We want to be consistent. And we also want to compare what's in there to those requirements that we might find in guidance or any other gaps that we might have with best practices. Now, we also want to look at those associated policies, and if they're actually describing activities or processes that belong to third-party risk management, we want to get in there and really make sure that they're accurately depicting what is happening, they're clearly communicating new rules and requirements, and that they're in alignment with your current practices. And then, of course, we want to look at all the spelling, grammar, how the information is organized, those abbreviations we're using, just to really get a sense of everything that is going to need to be corrected. All right, so once you've really taken that big look, you've gone in and you've marked everything up, you really know what it is that you have to change, make sure that you're incorporating those changes into a new version. Now, what's really important during this process is that you practice good document hygiene and version control. This means that every time you send out a new document, it should have a new version number. This helps your stakeholders know that they're correcting the right version and that you are incorporating things before you send it back. Once you have your updated version, get that feedback from your stakeholders, right? Make sure that you are saying, here's the new version. Can you take a look at it? Let me know your thoughts. Now, the last part of that is to incorporate the feedback or at least address it. So if I've gone out and asked you for a bunch of commentary and you've provided it for me, and I see the next version and it doesn't look like anything's been included or even addressed, that can be kind of frustrating. So at the very least, if you can't incorporate a change or there's a reason not to, work with that stakeholder to make sure they understand. This is really going to help your process be more effective and fluid over time. So incorporate that feedback or address it when you can't. All right, so we've gone out, we've identified the changes, we've made it, we've circulated these revisions with our stakeholders, we've incorporated the feedback, we feel good about those documents that they're ready for approval. So now we need to go ahead and get them approved. Now for policies, most organizations are going to have a very specific process for getting a policy approved. So go ahead and follow that. But when it comes to your program documents and procedures, there may not be any official approval process. So it's a good idea to sort of create your own and formalize it. That way your stakeholders will know when to expect updates or what they should be seeing and who approves it. And one thing that is really important in this whole process is to keep that log of reviews and approvals, right? So if an examiner comes in and they say, oh, I see you have a new policy from the last time I was in here, who approved it? Who reviewed it? When was it made effective? Keep a log of all that information, and it should be a running log so that you can see all the various iterations and approvals of those documents over time. Now, probably the most important step here after getting the document approved is to circulate it. Like I mentioned before, one of the most important things when it comes to policies or any of your government documents really is to make sure that people have access to them. So it doesn't really make any sense if you're going to do all that work and just store it on a SharePoint drive somewhere, nobody ever looks at it, it's never utilized. Again, that circulation and communication of the policy at a minimum, but your other documents as well, is something that your auditors and regulators will look for, because it's really hard to enforce a policy, for example, that nobody knows anything about. So make sure that you're making your documents accessible for anybody who needs them. Now, while you think about that, we are ready for our very last poll of the day. Jessie?
Our third and final poll question is, does your organization have a third-party risk management program document or something similar? Yes, yes, but it needs revisions, in development, no, or not sure. Hillary, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience.
All right.
Who should be responsible for writing third-party risk management procedures?
This is a great question, and it has a more complex answer. So when we think about third-party risk management procedures, they're going to cover a large portion of systems and stakeholders most typically. So what I do recommend is that procedures are written at the stakeholder level for one process at a time. So for example, if you have vendor owners that are engaged in opening and completing an inherent risk assessment, we would want a separate procedure for that. Now, third-party risk management can certainly write that procedure, but it's imperative that the people performing the procedure have input and can actually test that procedure before it's actually published, because we want to make sure that it makes sense for them, that it is addressing the actual steps they would take, and that it can effectively lead them to the right outcome. So while third-party risk management can be engaged in a lot of those procedures and writing them, we definitely want the people performing them to be involved. Now, if it's something that falls within your process that third-party risk management doesn't really own, say maybe you have a contract management system that's outside of your third-party risk management system, or a different approval process that's required before executing those contracts, you definitely want the owner of that process to be involved writing the procedure. I hope that helps.
And here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for answering this question. Before we continue, I would like to mention that we have our Creating and Updating Your Third-Party Risk Management Policy ebook available for download in the Related Content widget. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Hillary.
All right, as we are coming to the end of our time today, just want to leave you with a few key takeaways. The first one is, if nothing else, make sure you have a well-written third-party risk management policy that is approved by the highest level of your organization. Hopefully that's the board. This is a regulatory requirement for many, and it's at least a best practice. The other thing is, take time to read your existing policy and compare it to any regulatory guidance or best practices. If you're seeing any major gaps, it's a really good clue that a rewrite or an update is in order. This next one, said it so many times today, but one more time, make sure that the practices and work product that's outlined in your policy is consistent with what you actually do. Do not write policies to be aspirational or just to put in requirements that you don't follow because you think that's what the regulators want to see. What everybody wants to see is exactly what's happening today. Make sure that policy is accessible to everyone who needs it, everyone who manages a vendor, everyone who's a stakeholder in the third-party risk management process, your auditors, your SMEs, etc. And if you get beyond your policy, really think about those program documents. They are such a good tool, and they can be used to supplement that vendor owner training and to really help answer big questions for your management. So even though they take a lot of time and effort, they're well worth it. Take time to really prepare your documents carefully. This is work product that will be going to your auditors. It will be shared with examiners, potentially investors and other folks. So we want it as professional and buttoned down as it can be. And then finally, review and, if necessary, update those documents at least once a year and keep a change log. Now, with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jessie for some more information and Q&A. Jessie?
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Hillary for her time in sharing some important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On January 25th, our How to Develop and Write an Effective Third-Party Risk Management Policy Document webinar. And on February 6th, our State of Third-Party Risk Management 2024 webinar. We hope you will be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Hillary, our next question is the policy different for each department, or is it general for the whole organization?
Oh, that is such a great question. So absolutely, the policy should be general for the whole organization, right? We're talking about those baseline rules and requirements for third party at the organization, and they really should not vary by department. Now, what might vary by department are those procedures or processes that would be in the program. So think about the RACI. How might that be different from one stakeholder to another? But your policy should be uniform across the organization. Great question.
Great. Our next question. Can you tell us how this is different than the vendor management policy? Should we rename our vendor management policies to match the new guidance?
Okay, from that question, I'm going to infer that you are referring to the Interagency Guidance on Third-Party Relationships Risk Management version. And what I will recommend to you is, if your program is subject to those regulations or that guidance, that you do use the term third party. And the reason for that is the whole point of that updated guidance is to really clarify that we're talking about all kinds of third-party relationships. So any business relationship that's not a customer should be in scope. Now, that is very specific for financial institutions. If you aren't, my advice would be that whether you call it third-party risk management or vendor risk management, that you're consistent throughout the policy and your program documents, et cetera. And it's also a good idea in your policy to define what you mean by vendor. So you could say a vendor is any third-party relationship, which would include vendors, service providers, suppliers, et cetera. I hope that's helpful.
Great. Next question. Who is the driver for policy, process, and SOP? Is this COE or enterprise risk?
Okay, so I'm assuming you mean Center of Excellence. That's something that we hear a lot. When it comes to policies, who's the driver for it? That really is a function of sort of enterprise governance. So a lot of that is going to sit, at least have visibility through enterprise risk. The bottom line is that every organization is different. If you have third-party risk management or vendor risk management, you should have a policy that accompanies it. And again, the most important thing is that the highest level of the organization is approving it. Hopefully that's your board. I hope that helps.
Great. Our next question. Can a procurement policy stand as third-party risk policy document?
It depends. Without looking at it, it'd be hard for me to say. Now, procurement often has some elements that are not, directly part of that third-party risk management lifecycle. There may be some overlap. And for some organizations, third-party risk management is a subset of procurement or supply chain management. Whatever you're doing, if you have a procurement policy that encapsulates third-party risk management, you want to make sure that the information related to third-party risk management is very clear and addresses all parts of the life cycles and any requirement you have for third-party risk management within your organization. Because when the auditor or the regulator comes in, they're going to want to look at that. And if it's lackluster, it's kind of missing some things, that's not a good look, as they say. So I always recommend it has a separate policy, but if it must be included, it needs to be comprehensive.
Okay, great. Our next question. Can the risk rating methodology be included in the program document instead of the policy? Our organization's risk rating methodology has evolved over the past couple of years and will most likely continue to evolve.
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. So when we talk about the methodology used to risk rate that you include in your policy, what you want to think about is a more generalized statement that we look at the risks that are inherent to every product and service, that we risk rate on every vendor engagement versus at just a vendor level, and that we use risk ratings of, say, low, moderate, and high. Those are the kind of things. When it comes down to those actual calculations, like is cybersecurity weighted at a higher rate than reputational risk, that absolutely can go in your program document because those things do change and get refined over time. So your policy really should just be sort of the overview of the tools or methods you use where the program can really be those actual calculations, weighting tables, et cetera.
Great. Next question. Who gets to decide the roles and responsibilities that will be put into a RACI?
Well, that depends on your organization. So what I would recommend, first of all, is to make sure that your remit of third-party risk management is clearly identified. Work with your management and your senior leaders to make sure that there's a consistent understanding throughout about what tasks, say, third-party risk management would be responsible versus the business line versus the subject matter expert, et cetera. It's not so much as deciding who gets to decide. It's more about identifying what needs to be accomplished and, looking at your organization, determining who's going to be responsible for accomplishing that. Now, different organizations have different operating models. Some are completely consolidated where third-party risk management is doing the bulk of all the work. So that RACI may look very different than one in a hybrid environment where there's a dedicated risk management team and then the lines of business are doing individual activities to manage their vendors. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Hillary. I think we have time for one more quick question. How much detail should we include in our policy change log?
You definitely want to, make sure that you are always capturing the version control numbers, any approvals. When it comes to the changes, because you're going to have multiple iterations that come out while you're getting it approved and reviewed. Let's say you have something in your requirement around due diligence that wasn't very clear, needed to be updated. You might want to just copy and paste the actual section that's being changed. You'd want to have a column or some information about why it needed to be changed. It was unclear, didn't reflect current processes, whatever. And then you'd want to just have the copy or the exact verbiage that it was changed on that new version number. So they can see this is what it was, this is what it is now. You don't need to include everything like someone said, oh, there's an extra comma or change this word. Just reflect the initial needed change and the final change.
Thanks so much, Hillary. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thanks again, Hillary, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. Another big thank you to Hillary for her time and great content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources, including ones related to governance documents. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. On behalf of NMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.